1. c4 is known as the English opening, a flexible system that immediately contests the center and prepares to develop pieces while avoiding the most theoretically dense lines often found after 1. e4 or 1. d4. Developing the knight to f6 is a flexible and common response, preparing to castle and control the central squares, potentially leading to various Indian defenses or a symmetrical English structure. This move prepares to control the center with d4 and develops a piece towards the kingside, maintaining flexibility for white's pawn structure. Black prepares to fianchetto their queen's bishop to b7, aiming to control the long diagonal and challenge white's central pawn presence. This move initiates a fianchetto setup for white's king's bishop, aiming to control the long diagonal and prepare for kingside castling, while black's b6 aims to do the same for their queen's bishop. This move develops the bishop to a useful diagonal, supporting the center and preparing to castle kingside, fitting within the queen's Indian defense framework. This move fianchettos the bishop, preparing to control the long dark squared diagonal and supporting the center. A common theme in many English opening systems aiming for flexible pawn structures. This move prepares to develop the king's bishop, reinforcing the center and creating a solid pawn structure that is typical of Queen's Indian or Nimzo-Indian setups. Castling kingside is a natural and strong developing move, securing the king and connecting the rooks for future action along open or semi-open files. Developing the bishop to e7 supports the central pawn structure and prepares for further development, aligning with common plans in many English opening setups. Developing the knight to c3 supports a potential d4 pawn push and prepares to contest central squares. Completing kingside castling is a fundamental step in developing the king to safety and connecting the rooks, a standard principle in many English opening variations. This move prepares to support a central pawn advance, typically d4, to challenge black's queen's Indian defense setup and gain space. This move introduces central tension, aiming to challenge white's control of the d4 square and open lines for black's pieces. This pawn exchange on d5 opens the c-file for white's rook and clarifies the central pawn structure, aiming to exploit white's lead in development. This recapture opens the e-file for white's rook and completes black's pawn center, leading to a symmetrical pawn structure reminiscent of certain Queen's Indian lines. This move d4 reinforces the center and aims to establish a strong pawn presence, characteristic of many Queen's pawn openings and certain variations of the English opening. Fighting for central control. This move challenges white's central pawn control and opens a diagonal for black's queen, aiming to create counterplay and disrupt white's pawn structure. This move develops the bishop to a more active diagonal, eyeing black's queenside and potentially preparing to support a central pawn push. This knight sortie to a6 is a bit unusual, aiming to prepare a queenside expansion with c4 and potentially support a b5 push to challenge white's central control. This move repositions the knight to a more flexible square, anticipating a potential fianchetto of the queen's knight or preparing to advance the knight to c4, to contest the central squares and potentially attack black's queenside pawn structure. This move brings the queen to a more active central square, preparing to support pawn pushes like cxd4 or potentially enabling a queenside expansion with c5 later on. This knight maneuver redirects the knight to a more active central square, reinforcing the d4 pawn and preparing for potential knight outposts or pawn breaks on the kingside. This move prepares to contest the d-file and develop a rook to a more active central file, aiming to support pawn breaks and potentially pressure white's central pawn structure. This move aims to prevent black's bishop from potentially developing to g4 or h5, offering white greater control over the kingside and future pawn breaks like e4. Developing the rook to the c-file prepares for central pawn breaks and pressures white's queenside. This move repositions the rook to an active file, potentially challenging black's control and preparing for operations in the center or on the queenside. This pawn capture on d4 opens the c-file for black's rook and prepares to challenge white's central pawn presence, aiming for active piece play. This recapture is strategically sound as it centralizes the queen, activates a key piece, and prepares for potential central advances while maintaining pressure on black's weakened d5 pawn. This move initiates a strong initiative on the c-file, targeting white's queen and creating imbalances by placing the rook on an active, albeit potentially exposed, square. This move aims to redeploy the queen to a more active square, potentially supporting a central pawn push or defending against black's pressure on the c-file. This pawn thrust challenges white's central control and opens lines for black's pieces, aiming to create a dynamic and active position. This move simplifies the position by removing a key attacking piece from black's coordination, allowing white to better control the weakened light squares. This move recaptures the pawn and repositions the queen to a more active square, preparing to potentially challenge white's central control and exploit the open c-file. This move repositions the knight to a more active square, eyeing the weak pawn on c5 and preparing to potentially contest the d4 square or support a central pawn push. This exchange on the c-file, which has been a focal point of tension, now simplifies the position, allowing black to potentially exploit the weakened pawn structure on the queenside after white's recapture. This check forces black to recapture, breaking their pawn structure on the kingside and potentially creating an isolated pawn for black. This recapture on f6 develops black's bishop, strengthens the pawn center, and prepares to challenge white's more active rook on the open c-file. This move resolves the tension on the c-file, centralizing the queen and preparing to activate the rook on the open d-file, while also addressing black's pawn majority on the queenside. This move re-establishes pressure on the d4 pawn and prepares to challenge white's central control, aiming to exploit the potentially vulnerable d4 square in the ensuing play. The queen repositions to a more active square, eyeing potential tactics on the kingside and supporting the d4 pawn if black decides to advance. This move brings the knight to a central outpost, attacking white's queen and potentially disrupting their coordination while preparing to recapture the pawn on d4. This knight move prepares to redeploy to a more active square, likely f3, to bolster the kingside defense and potentially support a future kingside attack or central maneuver. This move, h5, initiates a strategic pawn storm on the kingside, aiming to create weaknesses in white's pawn structure and open lines for black's pieces against the enemy king. This move begins a pawn race on the kingside, aiming to create a passed pawn by pushing the kingside majority, while black will attempt to advance on the queenside. This pawn sacrifice is a bold attempt to open lines for your pieces and create a passed pawn, aiming to disrupt white's kingside structure and exploit the weakened light squares. This pawn capture opens a vital file for black's rook and creates a passed pawn threat on d3, necessitating careful attention from white. This move initiates a tactical sequence by exploiting the now open central files and placing the knight on a powerful central outpost, aiming to disrupt white's coordination and create threats against the king. This move centralizes the rook, preparing to contest the d-file and support the knight on e4, while also potentially defending against nc5. This move actively defends the pawn on c5 while also preparing to attack the white king by potentially bringing the queen to the kingside or reinforcing the central pawns. This move aims to disrupt black's active queen by offering a trade that simplifies the position and removes a well-placed enemy piece. This exchange simplifies the position, relinquishing black's strong bishop and opening the g-file for white, potentially creating future attacking opportunities. This recapture opens the h-file for white's rook, potentially creating attacking chances, and also resolves the immediate tension by exchanging pawns. The move qf5 repositions the queen to a more active square, preparing to contest the open d-file and potentially launch a kingside attack by coordinating with the knight on c5. This move repositions the rook to the second rank, preparing to support the kingside push and potentially contest the open d-file if black decides to advance their pawn further. This move repositions the rook to an active file, aiming to pressure white's d-pawn and potentially create threats along the fourth rank, exploiting the open nature of the position after the recent pawn exchanges. This move reorganizes the queen, preparing to contest the open c-file and potentially exploit the weakened dark squares around black's king. This pawn thrust advances the attack on white's kingside, aiming to disrupt white's coordination and potentially open lines for black's pieces. This pawn capture, while regaining material, opens the g-file and weakens your king's pawn shield significantly, creating potential tactical targets for black's queen and knight. This move attacks the h-pawn, aiming to create further complications and potentially open lines against the white king, while also indirectly defending the d3 pawn. This move aims to prevent black's dangerous knight from reaching a more active square and to control the critical c-file, thereby restricting black's initiative. This move exploits white's exposed king by transferring the rook to the h-file, threatening immediate mate on h2 and initiating a powerful mating attack by bringing more pieces into the assault. This move aims to contest the very active queenside passed pawn and re-establish a more solid pawn structure by forcing exchanges, potentially leading to an endgame where white's extra pawn on the kingside might become relevant. This move repositions the queen to a more active square, directly threatening white's rook and king, and creating a tactical challenge involving the vulnerable g2 pawn. The move prepares to reroute the queen to a more active central square while keeping an eye on the weak pawn structure black has created on the kingside. This move repositions the rook to a more active square, eyeing the d3 pawn and potentially preparing to support a pawn push on the queenside or create threats along the open d-file. This pawn push aims to weaken black's king safety by creating an escape square for the white queen, and potentially opening lines towards the black monarch. This pawn sacrifice, fxg6, opens the f-file for black's rook and simultaneously removes white's pawn, creating a more active position despite the material deficit, which is crucial for compensating for the sacrificed pawn. White plays k3, aiming to centralize the queen and support the advanced g-pawn while keeping an eye on potential tactical opportunities. This move repositions the rook to a more active file, preparing to challenge white's control of the open d-file and potentially create counterplay. This knight redeployment prepares to control the central dark squares and potentially reinforce the kingside if black attempts further pawn advances there. The move 36, nf4 is an excellent aggressive maneuver, directly attacking white's queen and king's side defenses while also preparing to occupy the strong e2 square, aiming to disrupt white's coordination and potentially create a passed pawn on the queenside. The capture on f4 simplifies the position, eliminating black's active queen and consolidating white's material advantage after the previous pawn sacrifice. This queen trade simplifies the position, leaving white with a material advantage and a strong knight outpost on f4. This move simplifies the position by trading queens and ending the immediate tactical skirmish, leading to an endgame where white has a material advantage with an extra pawn. This move initiates a mating attack by bringing the queen to the active g4 square, creating immediate threats against white's king and exploiting the pin along the g-file. This move repositions the knight to a more active central square, aiming to support the pawn push and potentially participate in attacking black's king. This move seeks to centralize the queen and activate it, while also potentially preparing for further pawn advances on the queenside or creating threats against white's king. This rook check forces the black queen to move, consolidating white's advantage after black's previous attempt to create counterplay with their queen. Moving the king to h7 defends against immediate checks on the g-file and prepares to escape to the third rank should the rook on d8 advance further. This move aims to prevent black's potential freeing maneuver with a5 and also to potentially create a queenside passed pawn later with a subsequent a4. The move 41, qc2 aims to contest the open c-file and potentially create threats against white's kingside, while also keeping the black king relatively safe. This king move aims to centralize and connect the rooks for potential activation on the central files or for defensive purposes, preparing to meet black's potential queenside activity. Black initiates an aggressive pawn push on the kingside with g5, aiming to create immediate attacking chances and potentially open lines against white's somewhat exposed king. The rook aggressively occupies the open 7th rank, threatening to infiltrate white's weakened kingside and create further complications with the passed pawn. Capturing the b3 pawn sacrifices your rook for minimal material gain and allows white's king to activate further, creating a dangerous passed pawn on the kingside. This knight maneuver repositions the piece to a more active square, aiming to control key central squares and potentially support a pawn advance or counter black's queenside play. Black's queen retreats to a5, centralizing and maintaining pressure on white's queenside pawns while preparing to potentially support a further pawn advance or escape the current threats. This move aims to centralize the king and prepare to support the queenside pawns, potentially looking to advance the b-pawn or consolidate the position after the material exchange. The queen check forces the white king to a more exposed position, potentially setting up tactical skirmishes and simplifying the material balance favorably for black. This move tucks the king away from immediate checks and prepares to coordinate his remaining pieces for a more active defense or potential counterplay. Though black's queenside majority remains a significant long-term threat, this move repositions the queen to a more active square, aiming to create threats against white's king or potentially prepare for a pawn push on the queenside. The king moves towards the center to become an active piece in the endgame, preparing to support the passed pawn. With the white king exposed on the queenside, black's g-pawn push aims to open lines and create mating threats against the opponent's king, exploiting the weakened pawn structure. The white king must stay active and support the d4 pawn's potential advance, while also being prepared to defend the kingside. This move forces the white king to a more exposed square, potentially allowing black to coordinate their remaining pieces for an attack or to win more material. This move is a forced continuation to avoid immediate material loss of the queen after black's check, and white must try to salvage the game from a significantly worse position with diminished material and pawn structure. This move is a tactical check that forces black's king to a precarious central square, potentially leading to further complications or even a mating attack. The king, having escaped the immediate danger and consolidated its position, now steps onto the queenside to support its advanced passed pawn, aiming to create further complications and a potential breakthrough. Black's queen needs to retreat to a safer square and guard against the advancing white pawns. So qf8 is a reasonable defensive repositioning to support the kingside and potentially the d-pawn. This forcing check by the knight aims to disrupt black's king's defense and potentially set up further attacks on the black king, exploiting the weakness created by black's pawn push on the kingside. This move seeks to consolidate the king's position by moving it to a safer square, preparing for potential counterplay or defensive maneuvers against white's aggressive pawn push and knight presence. This move aims to improve the knight's position to a more active square, potentially supporting a pawn advance or preparing to swing over to the kingside. With the opponent's king exposed on the queenside, black aims to create a passed pawn on the queenside by advancing the b-pawn, preparing to break through the white pawn chain. Re6 aims to activate the rook, control the crucial 7th rank, and potentially launch a kingside attack by exploiting white's pawn structure. The move b4 aims to create a passed pawn on the queenside by advancing the queenside pawn majority, potentially opening lines and creating counterplay if white is unable to stop it.